Okay, hello everybody. Lovely to have you here for this, the third session in our series on the mountain. Last week, our contributors pondered the way that the mountain has been depicted in art and in music. And in this session, we stay within that creative realm as we turn our attention to the literary mountain. And to offer their thoughts on this matter, we have with us three great friends of the Humanities Center. Tyler Hauer was educated at the University of Notre Dame and at the Ohio State University, specializing in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. He has taught in USD's Department of Philosophy for the past 21 years and is widely known to be one of the very finest instructors in our department, teaching a vast array of classes from logic through ethics to philosophy of mind and the philosophy of literature. He's been one of the central figures in the Humanities Center's critical engagement with artificial intelligence these past years and has been a regular speaker here. Tyler is co-editor of the substantial Oxford University Press book, Philosophy and the Human Condition, published in 2018. Fred Miller Robinson received his PhD from the University of Washington and is now Emeritus Professor of English, having been a member of faculty here at USD for 30 years, from 1991 to 2021. He's also been interim chair of the drama and music departments and received the Davies Award for Teaching Excellence in 2002 and the Drinan Award for Service in 2016. Among his many publications are the books Rooms in Dramatic Realism, published by Routledge in 2015, The Man in the Bowler Hat, His History and Iconography, and two superb books on comic theory, The Comedy of Language and Comic Moments. Fred was one of our first Minerva lecturers here in the Humanities Center, and he expertly directed the center during my sabbatical in 2021. Lisa Smith was educated here at the University of San Diego, where she received her master's in English. Her specialisms lie in the areas of contemporary fiction, literature for children and adolescents, the Bildungsroman, the weird and uncanny fiction. Among the enormous range of classes she's taught are courses especially designed for future educators. Now, those of us here in the center are supremely grateful to Lisa for her steadfast support of our work, which has shown itself in the development of imaginative seminar classes for our students and in memorable contributions to this ongoing landscape series of ours. So it really is a great delight to have the three of you with us today. Please give a very warm welcome to Tyler Hauer, Fred Robinson, and Lisa Smith.
Hello, everyone. Before I get started, I've been a little under the weather the last few days, so if there's anything confusing, it's because I have a sinus infection. If there's anything clear, it's because I'm brilliant. So it'll be mostly sinus infection. I want to talk today about Thomas Mann's Der Zauberberg, or the Magic Mountain, and the way that he imagines the mountain as a place of contemplation, as a place away from the lowland world. Before I do that, though, I want to say a few things about both why I care about this novel and sort of where Mann was in his life when he was writing it. I first read The Magic Mountain during a year between my undergraduate time and my graduate school. I didn't get into graduate school the first time, so I spent a year doing volunteer work in Milwaukee. And my supervisor was a Capuchin priest who was also a humanities lecturer at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And his specialty was inter and post-war Central European literature. He gave me a copy of The Magic Mountain. It's in fact the copy that I have with me today. And I read it at a time that was very much a time of transition in my life. which works well because it's, in a way, a novel that is about transitions. I read it then. I loved it when I read it first, when I was about the same age as the protagonist, and I've read it several more times since then. As for Mon, let me click correctly. There he is a little later in his life. By the time the novel was published in 1924, he was already a well-known author, especially for his numerous short stories, Death in Venice, sort of prime among them, and his 1901 sort of masterwork, Buddenbrooks, which was a story inspired by his own family's history among the merchant patrician elites of the Hanseatic city of Lubeck. It's a story of a family's rise, success, and decline. He uses himself sort of as a figure a lot. The main protagonist of the Magic Mountain is sort of socially located about the same place that Mon is, from an elite family that gets its money and its history from the merchant class, from the Hanseatic region of Germany. So he's writing a story, again, that is a little bit a story of his own family. It also is set in a place that he had visited when his fiancée was recovering from tuberculosis in a sanitarium. So in 1924, he's a well-known author. He's 5 years away from winning the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he's having something of a personal crisis. He had been very much an advocate of the First World War. He had sold some property right before the war began and then invested all of that money in war bonds. And then it's 1924 in the Weimar Republic. Things are not going well, and those war bonds didn't pay off. He also invested his father-in-law's money in those. It's not a great time. Things are not particularly good, even though he's well known. Also, he's in Weimar, Germany. It's a world in tumult, and tumult that is going to get only worse for him and his family. Just sort of to locate him. The novel, though, let's talk about that. I can't possibly summarize everything that happens in the novel. It's over 700 pages long, and it goes through many years of activity. But I want to focus primarily on the beginning and the ascent of the protagonist, both literal and figurative, of the magic mountain of the title. We're at what looks like the zenith of the German Empire. It's the early years of the 20th century. The Great War and the resultant collapse lie in the future. And the story of the Magic Mountain is of a young man at a turning point in his life and a turning point in his world. He is an orphan of a patrician family of Hamburg named Hans Castorp. He's described as being in his 23rd year and having completed the academic part of a technical education as an engineer. He's a decent student, he's passed his finals, but Mon tells us he's done so, quote, quite respectfully if without any fanfare of trumpets. He's good enough, but he's not a standout or a star. He's on the cusp of beginning an apprenticeship with a shipbuilding firm, but the effort of prepping for his exams has taken a toll on him. His experience is one we probably all shared. He's in a little bit of bad health after all the work that he's put in to get through his finals. So his family doctor and his uncle both suggest that he needs a change of scenery and a bit of a rest before he embarks on his practical training and the career that will undoubtedly follow upon it with all its attendant familial and community responsibility. There is very much a future ahead of him, one that's been mapped out for him, a future that is determined in great part by the past of his family and his city. As it is, luckily for him, he has a cousin named Joachim Ziemsen, who is an officer trainee, who has been in a sanitarium in Davos in Switzerland for 5 months, being treated for tuberculosis, all the time rankling against the regime that keeps him from his own practical concern, completing his own training and entering on his military career. What could be better than for him to go and visit his cousin for 3 weeks, only 3 weeks, that's all the time he's going to go, get better himself and relieve some of the boredom of his cousin. He can do a favor for a relative and also recover and get ready to pursue his career. Hans is basically like many of our students. He's completed his studies, or he's completing his studies, but he's got a very practical concern. He wants to get a job. It's the world of work that matters to him. He is a thoroughly practical person from a thoroughly practical place and family. What he wants to do most in his life is build ships. That's what he cares about. In a city that has made its fortune and reputation and maintained its relative independence on the back of trade and shipping. He comes from a family that's taken part in that trade and the day-to-day government of the city-state of Hamburg. His paternal grandfather, who raises him after he's orphaned, is a senator in the city. A man, Hans says, who only gets his true identity when he's dressed in his ceremonial robes. When his grandfather dies, he's raised then by a maternal uncle, another man of business and a consul in the city. Hans is of the world and destined for it. It's worth pointing out that as a Hamburger, he's also a man whose natural home is at sea level. That is where he's from. He makes this point again and again. But now he's going to go to a sanitarium in Davos. This is the one that inspires Mann, another image of the same place. Beautiful, there in summer, earlier in winter. He's going to go and visit his cousin. And Mann describes it from the first chapter called Arrival. Let me get the... Such was the experience of young Hans Castorp. He had not meant to take the journey seriously or commit himself deeply to it, but to get it over quickly, since it had to be made, to return as he had gone, and to take up his life at the point where, for the moment, he had had to lay it down. Only yesterday he had been encompassed in the wonted circle of his thoughts, and entirely taken up by two matters, the examination he had just passed, and his approaching entrance into the firm of Tundra and Wilms, shipbuilders, smelters, and machinists. With as much impatience as lay in his temperament to feel, he had discounted the next 3 weeks, but now it began to seem as though present circumstances required his entire attention, that it would not be at all the thing to take them too lightly. This being carried upward into regions where he had never before drawn back breath, and where he knew that unusual living conditions prevailed, such as could only be described as sparse or scanty, it began to work upon him, to fill him with a certain concern. Home and regular living lay not only far behind, they lay fathoms deep beneath him, and he continued to mount above them. Poised between them and the unknown, he asked himself how he was going to fare. Perhaps it had been ill-advised of him, born as he was a few feet above sea level, to come immediately to these great heights, without stopping at least a day or so at some point in between. He wished he were at the end of his journey, for once there he could begin to live as he would anywhere else, and not be reminded by this continual climbing of the incongruous situation he found himself in. He's leaving behind what he knows, but only, he thinks, as a very quick trip, after which he will return to what he's left behind and get on with his real life. But while he's here in this area utterly foreign to him, quote, it began to seem as though present circumstances required his entire attention, that it would not be at all the thing to take them too lightly. Here I think we see a contrast that Mann is pointing out, a contrast at least as old as philosophy, between a world of being and a world of becoming, but also between two ways of living, a practical way of living and a contemplative way of living. The kind of contemplative life that Aristotle points out in the Nicomachean Ethics as being in some ways better than the practical. As Aristotle says, the activity of reason, which is contemplative, seems both to be superior in serious worth and to aim at no end beyond itself, and to have its pleasure proper to itself, and the self-sufficiency, leisureliness, unweariedness, and all the other attributes ascribed to the supremely happy man are evidently those connected with this activity. It follows that this will be the complete happiness of man, if it be allowed a complete term of life. I think that we see the protagonist going from the world of practice, the world of activity, the political life, to a life of forced leisure, as we'll see. Mann is presenting the mountain as a place of contemplation, a place away from the practical concerns of the world down below. In fact, the residents of the International Sanatorium Berghof, that's where he's located, have no practical concerns at all. They eat 5 hearty meals a day, and they are described in detail with so much food. After every one of them, of course, they take a little walk and then they sleep because there's nothing else they can do. They're permitted the minimum of exercise, walks in the mountain and walks into the Dorf, the village. They take their rest wrapped up against the cold on the balconies of their room. Their rooms are both exceedingly modern and also almost monastic in their austerity. And their one other activity is a ritualized measuring of their temperatures, constantly, with their mercury cigars, or quicksilver cigars, depending on the translation. Interspersed with that essential lack of activity, they talk with one another, with other convalescents in the numerous facilities that are around Davos, and with their doctors, Hofrat Behrens, the director, and his assistant Krakowski, whose interests are more psychological than physiological. In picturing the mountain this way, I think Mann is using an ancient trope, both literally and actually. The mountain as a place to retreat and refresh and think, and perhaps to commune with God or the gods. The gods reside on Mount Olympus, and other mountains play in their origin stories. Moses climbs Mount Sinai to speak to God. 3 different communities hold the Temple Mount sacred. Think of that once ubiquitous cartoon, it was in every New Yorker, of someone climbing to see the guru up on his mountain cave. There's this idea that the mountain is a place to go away and contemplate. Or to use an example that was certainly in Mann's mind, Mann was an admirer of Nietzsche's, and took the title of The Magic Mountain from The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche. To take one example, then consider the retreat that Nietzsche's Zarathustra makes to his cave on his mountain to think and contemplate the coming of the Übermensch, coming down only again when people have mistaken his teachings and they need to be corrected. He's giving us an image of, I think, retreating from the world in order to contemplate, but also returning to that world with the fruits of that contemplation. Just a couple of other examples. We see the same kind of image in other literature. If you've ever read Lost Horizon, the idea of Shangri-La as a place away where time works differently, where things are entirely different than they are down below, or in the real world, very real Tibetan lamas, the monks of Mount Athos, the Carmelites of Mount Carmel, the Carthusians in their mountain retreat at the Grande Chartreuse. The mountain is a place to get away from the world. It is a place to go and contemplate. When Castorp gives his entire attention to his new location and situation, he quickly turns from his native practicality and his bourgeois pleasures to philosophical speculation and to the kind of asceticism that's allowed to you when you're ill, when you're allowed to retreat from the world and not worry about practical concerns. Now, in this, he loses his greatest pleasure. The one thing he loves more than all is a particular brand of cigar. He's brought cases and cases with him, and he says he's only 22, so he must have been horrid. The descriptions of him physically are quite something. But he takes them again in the mountain air. He says they're the only reason he ever eats meals, so he can have the cigar afterwards. But they feel like now papier-mâché to him, and he has to throw them away. He loses the pleasures he's had, he loses the things he's enjoyed, but he sees that he has a different set of constraints and different freedoms than those that he had before. He's walking one day with his cousin, Joachim, and he's shocked by the way that a young woman in a passing group whistles at him. She whistles without opening her mouth at all. A sound comes out of her, and Joachim explains to him that she has a pneumothorax. They've closed up one of her lungs and filled it with gas so it will heal. And it's a trick that she has, that she can whistle at people. And he's kind of troubled by this, as you undoubtedly would be if someone has whistled with their lung at you, and talks to his cousin. And Joachim says to him, so Joachim sought for a reply. Good Lord, Joachim says, they are so free. I mean, they are so young, and time is nothing to them. And then they may die, perhaps. Why should they make a long face? Sometimes I think being ill and dying aren't serious at all, just a sort of loafing about and wasting time. Life is only serious down below. You will get to understand that after a while, but not until you've spent some time up here. Here is a place where life's seriousness has fallen away. Other concerns concern us. He gets rid of his useless Marias and replaces them with the Quicksilver cigar, the thermometer that is the key, as I said, to the ritualized and repetitive lives that they live in the rarefied air of the mountain. And quite to the consternation of Joachim, his cousin, he starts to philosophize. So another passage. I'll stop reading to you after a couple of minutes. They're outside on the balconies of their rooms, where they're supposed to be experiencing the cold, fresh, clean, thin air of the mountains to help their lungs. And Joachim is doing his measuring. He's taking his temperature. And Hans says to him, how long does that go on? He asked, turning around. Joachim raised 7 fingers. 7 minutes? But they must be up. Joachim shook his head. A little later, he took the thermometer out of his mouth, looked at it, and said, yes, when you watch it, the time goes very slowly. I quite like the measuring. 4 times a day, for then you know what a minute or 7 of them actually amounts to. Up here in this place, where the 7 days of the week whisk by the way they do. You say actually, Hans Castorp answered. He sat with one leg flung over the balustrade, and his eyes looked bloodshot. But after all, time isn't actual. When it seems long to you, then it is long. When it seems short, why, then it is short. But how long or how short it actually is, that nobody knows. He was unaccustomed to philosophize, yet sometimes somehow felt an impulse to do so. This is a practical 22-year-old who only cares about shipbuilding, and now he's worried about the nature of time. He's left the world and something else has happened to him. As time goes on, he's joined in that philosophizing by a humanist, a strange character, a strange Italian man named Herr Settembrini, who admires the literary Satan and his freedom. He converses with a Marxist revolutionary Jesuit convert, there's a lot of things in there, who advocates for terrorism, named Nafta. He meets a Dionysian figure who then commits suicide and is also a rival in his love, Peppercorn. He discusses things with his cousin who wants nothing more than to return to duty and disastrously attempts to do so. And he almost falls in love, though he fails in love. He lives an entire life and utterly unlike what he lived down below. That takes more than 3 weeks. On almost his second, I think it is his second day there, he has a cough and coughs up blood. He too is infected. He too has tuberculosis. And so he stays in the sanatorium. He attempts, as I said, and does not quite achieve love. He comes face to face with his own mortality in an amazing chapter called Snow, where he's stuck in a blizzard. And he has these amazing dreams. He faces the mortality of those around him. He loses his cousin. He spends, in fact, 7 years of a 3-year trip away from the only world he's ever known, in what is almost entirely a dreamlike state. What's never really clear in Mann's presentation is whether the mountain, the dream of the mountain, is the illusion in contrast to the real world below, or vice versa. Whether he has somehow escaped Plato's cave and this is the real world. This is where things are as they are, and down below something is wrong. But in the end, Hans wakes up from his dream. He's awoken by the crisis that begins the Great War. So one more passage, and then I will let you listen to something more interesting. This is from a chapter near the end called The Thunderbolt. He's just learned that his maternal uncle, who for a period functioned as father for him, has died. In the time of which we speak, all contact between him and the flat land had ceased. He sent no letters thither and received none thence. He no longer ordered Maria Mancini, his cigar, having found a brand up here to his liking, to which he was now as faithful as once to his old-time charmer, a brand that must have carried even a polar explorer through the sorest and severest trials, armed with which and no other solace, Hans Castorp could lie and bear it out indefinitely, as one does at the seashore. It was an especially well-cured brand with the best leaf wrapper, named Light of Asia. Rather more compact than Maria, mousy gray in color with a blue band, very tractable and mild and evenly consuming to a snow-white ash, that held its shape and still showed traces of the veining of the wrapper, so evenly and regularly that it might have served the smoker for an hourglass, and did so, at need, for he no longer carried a timepiece. His watch had fallen from his night table. It did not go, and he had neglected to have it regulated, perhaps on the same grounds as had made him long since give up using a calendar, whether to keep track of the day or to look out an approaching feast, the grounds, namely, of his freedom. Thus he did honor to his abiding everlasting, his walk by the ocean of time, the hermetic enchantment to which he had proved so extraordinarily susceptible that it had become the fundamental adventure of his life, in which all the alchemistical processes of his simple substance have found full play. Thus he lay, and thus in high summer, the year was once more rounding out the 7th year, though he knew it not, of his sojourn up here, then like a thunder peal. And he's called back to the world. Disastrously. He descends to join the German army, and he dies. He had an escape, maybe a lucky escape, maybe a contemplative one, but then he's called back to what is either the cave or the real world, which destroys him. That's all.
So, I can't see this very well. I'm always shocked at how big this is when I get here. Hello, everyone. I'm all of you, students, thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really happy to be here. And I want to say big thank you to Brian again for inviting me. It's an honor. My dear friend, colleagues here, it's nice to be with both of you. So this presentation went through lots of iterations. It was really hard for me. I, up until a week ago, was also going to add Milton to this Paradise Lost. I know, what was I thinking? It turns out it was about a 4-hour presentation. So Milton is gone. And it's too bad because it was funny and I liked it a lot. So just to make things a little bit more obvious, I'm going to use Dante here. In this picture of Dante, and this is kind of important to set this thing up about metaphors, you see him, and he's standing here, and he's in front of his creation, Purgatorio, and he's real, apparently. Is he in the world? And that's Purgatorio. He's holding his creation, Purgatorio, in which he is also a character. So it is this endless, he's meta, is what we would call Dante. Everything's in everything is in everything, and hence this little quotation that I chose here. There are mountains hidden in mountains. There are mountains hidden in hiddenness, which is from Dogen, the 13th century Japanese monk, and it kind of speaks to this, I think. So let's go into Dante here. So in literature, as in life, a mountain or mountains offer a lot of metaphorical possibilities. In the landscape, they're beautiful, they're inspiring, they're challenging, they're inspirational, they're foreboding, they're terrifying, all at the same time. Starting with the shape of them. Maggie, it's not doing anything. Why is that? Is it me? Oh, thank God. It's such a relief. Not embarrassing myself entirely up here. Okay. So where were we? We were starting with the shape. Okay. So starting with the shape, they stand out in the landscape. They offer a view if you can get to the top. They serve as signposts or perhaps obstacles geographically or metaphorically in a life. So much of it depends on your spatial or your perspective of the mountain. Are you on it? Are you in it? Are you under it? Are you next to it? Are you ascending or are you descending? Metaphors are the literal turned into the figurative in order to illustrate abstractions or feelings or things that we don't have proper words for and have trouble expressing. The mountain, of course, is sometimes just a mountain. It exists. But in the mind or the imagination, it can become many things. So looking at fiction and nonfiction, which I looked at a lot, the nonfiction seems to primarily consist of these ascent narratives, the Everest climbing stories. But I found in both fiction and in nonfiction this notion of the spiritual or the existential possibilities of the mountain. The Bible, as Tyler was talking about, is rife with mountains. They're places to receive wisdom, to contemplate, to escape, to transcend, or like that one guy, to transfigure. So that happens. It's important that mountains are mostly vertical. They themselves ascend. They're closer to the heavens, they're closer to God or the cosmos or the mysteries of the stars, whatever word you want there. Geographically and representationally, the summit, the peak, the pointy, is the topmost place. It's where the earth touches the sky. But crucially, there's still a space to be crossed if we want to go into the other worlds. Humans have to climb to that highest point between these two worlds if they want to receive or perhaps transcend or to breach the gap into the other world. They must go into that rarefied air. Or maybe sometimes the two, humans and gods or angels or stars, can meet on the frontier, on the top. The highest mountain range on the earth, the Tibetan plateau, is metaphorically called the roof of the world, which I think is a particularly pretty image. This is the Tibetan plateau, but viewed from the International Space Station, which is, well, it's beautiful, is what this is. It's beautiful. If we had another hour, we could talk about this switch in perspective. This is the God view. Right? This is the thing that we don't haven't had and now have. It's very beautiful. To build on the idea of the mountain as the highest place, or the place we have to climb if we want to see these higher things, we can then figuratively see the mountain as a staircase. And again, what remains at the summit is to cross the gap between the terrestrial and the celestial. In literature and art, that crossing is often done by things that we can see or that we know, ladders or bridges. Over there is Jacob and his dream and his ladder. There are angels going up to heaven. I just have got to put this out there to you. I've never understood. If you look very closely at that picture, what?
Looks like some are going down.
You know, I don't know what they're doing. Michelle, they're going up and down. He's dreaming, okay? But they've got wings, and they take up half their body. Why do they need a ladder? This is just endlessly confusing to me about this. Is this some, I don't know. This, I don't actually know what's happening here. This is a Russian icon. There seem to be men. They don't seem to be angels. The angels are up there. The Christ is up there. These patriarchs, I think, are standing under a hill or something. But the great thing about this picture is these guys are being picked off by demons. They're actually lassoing them and pulling them down. There's a guy with an arrow, and then this poor unfortunate is headfirst into the earth. But again, my point is about this staircase. So the shape, this triangular shape, what looks like an imitation of a mountain, is repeated in structures throughout human history. This is the Ur-Ziggurat of Mesopotamia. That is a temple in India whose name I don't know. These are old photographs. This has been restored, but the important thing is the staircases and the shape, the mountain here. That is Fanjing in China. This picture does not do it justice because you can't see the actual bottom. It's the most spectacular structure. It's about 500 years old, apparently. It's been rebuilt many times. This is Uxmal in the Yucatan. It's apparently constructed according to astronomical calculations. Some of you probably know more about it than I do. But what's important here is the staircases, but also that imitation of the mountain, the steps that are going to lead you to the top. And again, here, that is the Sphinx Observatory in Switzerland. It's on the Jungfrau. I love that building. It's really great. Here is a NASA rocket, same shape. Here, poignantly, is World Trade Center 1, the North Tower, with its 106th and 107th floor, and the restaurant that was called Windows on the World. So that is the shapes that I'm interested in. Now, on to Dante and his Purgatorio. Purgatorio is the second book in the Divine Comedy. It's preceded by the Inferno and followed by Paradiso. Here we have him once again being very meta. There's the mountain, there's the author, there's the meta, there's the mountain, whatever. It's all these circles of that happening. It's a journey. The story's a journey through the afterlife. Dante, the character, he's received permission to go on this journey because the Virgin Mary herself, St. Lucia and his dead love Beatrice, have interceded on his behalf. He's had a crisis of faith, and she thinks maybe this will restore it, and maybe if he goes and talks to God a little bit, he'll pull it together. She's dead, but it's all very confusing. Whatever, she's waiting. So it is vaguely strange, that thing about, you have to keep in mind, and this is the metaphorical thing of keeping two things in your mind at once. He's alive, but he's also dead-ish, so it's sort of strange. This is going to apply to the mountain as well. Purgatorio is fantastical. It's completely made up by him. It's filled with metaphor and representation. It's not like in some stories, Frankenstein, for example, where you have Mont Blanc, which exists in this world, but then interacts with the fictional world. He made this up. However, throughout the story, he's still at very great pains to convince us that it's a real mountain and that it's here on Earth. In fact, in his lifetime and even centuries later, people were trying to posit the coordinates so that you could actually go out and find it. Mount Purgatorio has an origin story. Satan, the angel, formerly known as Lucifer, when he falls to Earth, he doesn't just hit the Earth, he goes way down into the middle of the Earth, and that crater creates hell. And then the Earth that is displaced or kicked up by the impact creates Purgatorio. So that's pretty great. It is, he tells us, in the southern hemisphere, and it rises straight up out of the ocean. He's very clear. When you read the comedy, he has a lot of geography and a lot of science as he knew it. That's kind of important. So hell was believed to be directly underneath Jerusalem. And so apparently the Antipodes is the Southern Ocean. And it's a pretty good place to put a mountain, I suppose. He describes the stars in the Southern Hemisphere. He had knowledge of them. He knows about time zones. He's obsessed with time. He has, in fact, a schedule. He needs to get to the summit by Easter Sunday. So here, looking at these, this is Botticelli, actually. And it looks like an upside-down mountain on a ball, but you have to keep in mind that this stuff on the side is actually Earth. This is the crater. This is hell, right? And this is a little bit better. If you put these two together, you can see the inverted cone mountain shape, which is hell, and then Purgatorio coming up to the top. Here's two other pictures of it. So, where am I? So the mountain itself, so in the opening Purgatory, Dante has just come out of the Inferno. He's come up, and he's being ferried over here to Purgatorio, to the base. The mountain has 9 levels altogether, counting top and bottom level. The bottom is called Ante-Purgatorio, A-N-T-E, the before, it's the chamber. What it really is it's base camp. It's base camp for these souls, and the souls that are down here hanging around base camp, they are mostly the excommunicated and the late to the repentance party people. And they have to stay here and they have to acclimate. And they have to get used to this new state. They're the most attached. They're still the most attached to their bodies and to their previous life. So they hang around here and then they are allowed to ascend. The structure itself, it has 7, he calls them terraces. There are 7 terraces. And they each represent one of the 7 deadly sins. So you've got sloth and greed and lust and whatever the rest of them are. At the highest level is Eden. That's the garden, and there it is at the top. So visually, the thing represents the fall. So if you just plunged off the top of this, you could just keep falling until you got down to the bottom of hell. And one of these souls has to work their way up to the top, and you have to stop, and you have to contemplate each of these sins and think about how they apply to your life, et cetera, et cetera. He tells us, it's kind of an interesting thing, I think. He says that all the sins that are committed are sins of love, that they are just misdirected or excessive or too little. At the antechamber of the bank, I didn't show you this one. I like this particular, that's very detailed. This I like because, again, he understands the world is spherical. This is the cosmos. And the Inferno, this is Jerusalem. And if I could turn the slide upside down, you would be able to see the little buildings on top, so you understand the world as this round thing. But, okay, back to the base camp where Dante is hanging around. An angel comes to him, and he carves with a sword 7 P's, peccatum, which are sins on his forehead. And as he levels up in this ascension game, they disappear one by one. This is a great picture. Those aren't actually carved. They're snakes, which makes it even more horrific. So he's warned on this journey, don't look back. Don't look back, which is analogous to this don't look down of climbing great heights, because your fear will cause you to fall. You'll be pulled back to the earthly, the best known, the most loved. Dante, he's the only embodied person on the mountain. He casts a shadow, which is just remarked on by everyone. Everyone else is a figure. They're a shade. This is metaphor world. Everyone is a stand-in, a placeholder for someone that was but is no longer. This mountain is a place of figures, of concepts. It's conceptual, the whole thing. Nothing is real in the sense of worldly. But Dante, the character in Dante, the author, and we, as a reader, we have to see them as embodied. We have to see angels and things because our small human minds can't take in the concept of something that doesn't reflect something we know in the world. He struggles on the climb. At one point, Virgil says to one of the angels, he's eager, but he's slow. He's got a body, and that hinders him. He gets tired, and he sits down, and he says that he looks into the void, and he's scared. This is Fanjing, the Chinese mountain top that I showed you. That is the staircase that you will climb if you want to visit. I know. Like, what kind of person would do that? It is beyond me. I can't even look at the slide.
And they had to carry up all the materials.
I don't know. You haven't even seen it, and I don't know how many thousand feet it is. It's like 7,000 feet or something insane. It's crazy. So anyway, And he looks over the side, and, he's scared, as you might be. So he also tells us these great details that I like a lot. He says that the mountain occasionally, he says, it trembles. And it trembles when a soul feels that it's pure, or it's ready to rise, or to set out on its great ascent. It's a little bit like little earthquakes or avalanches or, rock slides on Everest that portend some other thing. I don't even know where I am in this. Okay. So he makes his way through these levels of Purgatorio fairly easily. He has a little trouble when he gets to pride. He has to sit down, have a little think, because, apparently this has been problematic for him. When he finally gets to the summit, he gets to Eden, which you have to remember he's still on Earth. That is a terrestrial place. He has to say goodbye to Virgil, because Virgil, alas, is a pagan. He has to get back to limbo for eternity. That's where he's going to be. He then meets his true love, the obsession of his life, his muse. He's dedicated everything he's ever written to her, Beatrice, who may or may not have been a real person. It's very exciting for the reader, particularly the reader of his time, because he mourned this woman deeply. And so this is a real love reunion thing that's going to happen. Although weirdly, he sees her and she berates him for a couple pages about, it's not really clear what, some sort of fight that they had back in like 1265 or something. So anyway, she's going to lead him to the border between the worlds, in other words, between Earth and Paradiso. So in the end, he's ready. He's ready to step off the mountain and cross the Great Divide, leaving the terrestrial for the purely celestial, and he hopes to experience God, to see the face of God. It's going to mean crossing the final frontier, stepping into the void, disappearing into thin air, which, if you're human, necessarily means to cease to breathe. But he doesn't. At the end of Purgatorio, Dante says, I came away, he means from the climb. I came away remade, pure and prepared to rise up to the stars. Alle stelle, he says. So to sort of conclude here, Purgatorio it's a perfect metaphor. It's a real true mountain of the mind. Again, we can only understand things in real earthbound images. So something that is wholly made up must still be wholly made up out of parts that we already know. They can be reconfigured in a new way, but they still have to be things that we can recognize. And then from there, the invisible or the intangible or the conceptual becomes manifest and real and solid. Viewed in this way, I think that the story of Mount Purgatorio is analogous to the mountain climbing narratives. It's an ascension story. It's a story about summiting. And all of this, the climbs, the levels, the ties to the shape of the staircase temples, the levels of Everest from base camp to the balcony to the summit that you have to go on, all of it, they're of a piece. It's about trying to reach, I think, or see the heavens. Maybe we're just trying to find enlightenment or find the portal, to transcend, to be godlike, to lift off, not need to breathe, maybe not use supplemental oxygen on Everest, maybe just to disappear into thin air, yeah. Dante says that the mountain of Purgatorio, and I think this is important, he says, it unsins us. It unsins us as we climb, meaning to cast off the world and the things that heat us. Maybe to climb the mountain, to stand there on one of the roofs of the world, no matter how high it actually is to come away clean and return to earth as we know it, perhaps altered within and with new perspective. I'm going to leave you with one more perspective of a mountain. Here is the figurative made literal. This person has made a mountain out of a molehill. And, it is complete with a little British flag at the top, Brian. Yeah, colonialist. And here, for those of you, I will leave you to think about this. For those of you who are old enough, you can sing it. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Thank you.
This is there's my topic. It's turned out to be a lot more about Cezanne than it is about Wallace Stevens, which leaves me with a lot of slides, which I have never ever used very much in lectures, so bear with me. First, Cezanne. As far as I know, there is no agreed upon distinction between hills and mountains. In reference to art, one critic referred to hills as excuses for bodies. I will add that mountains, as typically depicted, are excuses for gods. Like Hokusai's Mount Fuji, Am I already having trouble?
Oh, it's the same.
Oh, that's... I
Same
should,
issue as Lisa. Sorry.
okay. Like Hokusai's Mount Fuji, they are sacred ground, rising to the heavens with an imposing aura of majesty. Places you go if, like Jesus, you are to be transfigured or to ascend to heaven. Mount Fuji had religious and cultural significance before Hokusai painted it more than 100 times. It's that kind of mountain. This idea and view of mountains is obvious enough, yet it is striking that it has so little to do with the only other artist, to my knowledge, who painted the same mountain over and over again, the Frenchman Paul Cézanne, who painted Le Mont Saint-Victoire 60 times in oil and watercolor over roughly a decade spanning the 19th and 20th centuries. Saint-Victoire is a neighborly mountain, about 1/4 the height of Mount Fuji, with no snow on it. Oh, so I'll give you a slide. What do I should? Okay, thank you. Let's see. In fact, it is a limestone ridge, its westernmost and highest rock face, looming over the town of Aix-en-Provence, where Cézanne was born, lived, and died. Although it is the highest point around, I don't think it was ever the height of Saint-Victoire that struck Cézanne, much less its majesty. He was more interested in peasant card players and apples and minor valleys than in majesty. It was instead the stillness, the constancy of the mountain that struck him. Light, of course, can alter mountains, but Cézanne's landscapes, with or without mountains, are as devoid of the time of day as they are of people. I'll let that other one go. Never mind. No, Cézanne was struck by mountains as bedrock, something unchanging, nature itself as a perpetual presence. Yet what he set out to do in the last decade of his life, he died in 1906, was to subject the mountain to the changes that occurred when he saw it from different sites and at different angles. He did not assume Mont Saint-Victoire's reality as a settled manner. In Cézanne's paintings, Mont Saint-Victoire is not just there, it is seen, altering when Cézanne moved his head to the side. In this way, nature had to be, in Cézanne's recurring word, realized, that is, made real. He called Mont Saint-Victoire a beau motif, a beautiful theme, not a mountain as such, but a possible idea of one that could organize the landscape around it. Mont Saint-Victoire had to become something made active by his visions of it. Here we can see in this later painting of Mont Saint-Victoire techniques Cézanne had been developing throughout his career, techniques which involved pulling the subject away, the mountain say, toward the picture plane, the two-dimensional canvas. This is a dumb way of looking at it, but it's like, here is the scene in front of you, and we are going to bring it toward the canvas. Toward the activity of the artist and the view of anyone beholding the painting. One of these techniques was the disruption, if that's not too strong a word, of linear perspective, the illusion of depth on a flat surface. In this painting, it is almost absent. On first seeing Cézanne's landscapes, the Anglo-Irish writer Samuel Beckett wrote to a fellow Irishman that Cézanne had at last avoided the complacent points of view of the landscape gardener and the owner of the domain. That is, the creation of property through perspective, a view, a scene. Another technique was achieving the same effect by downplaying aerial perspective, the use of color to create the illusion of distance. Pale colors like azure for a different mountain, for a distant mountain, not here, for example. Bold colors for nearness. Consider the lack of stillness in Cézanne's still lives. The writer Peter Handke called them the moment before the earthquake. Here there is no table to secure the apples and the tablecloth and the compote jar from spilling toward the picture plane, towards us. And yet the apples are robustly there. Consider briefly the pop artist Roy Lichtenstein's early homage to Cézanne, The Black Flowers. In the actual painting, which I saw last month in the Broad Museum in LA, and if memory serves, the table was smaller and more tilted toward the picture plane. In any case, the flowers are coming right at us like a gaggle of clowns, not even contained in the picture plane, and they are only black in outline. This is one small proof of what Picasso said of Cézanne, that he was the father of us all, that is, of modern artists. Picasso spoke of Cézanne's disquiet, his world as strange, disturbed, unstable. This effect is connected to Cézanne's own description of his intention, which was to make objects more real than they would be if seen in the stabilizing depths of perspective. I'm touching something, I realize. Okay, thank you. Here is a third example of Cézanne's techniques of realization. He painted the whole canvas at once, a color at a time, so that patches of green and ochre appear in the sky, the blue of the mountain appears in the foreground trees. This might not be the particular picture I wanted, but that's all right. The blue of the mountain appears in the foreground trees. The point is not representation, but creation. Cézanne wrote that tones of color, they form lines, become objects, rocks, trees, without my thinking about it. They acquire volume. They have an effect, unquote. We're aware of a canvas and at the same time are aware of the reality of the mountain as a process born of being seen, made real in the picture plane. The interdependence of reality and the imagination as the origin of change was the central subject of the American poet Wallace Stevens in the later years of his life, the 40s and early 50s, in both his poems and his essays. Consider these lines in the light of Cézanne. Quote, "We keep coming back and coming back to the real, to the hotel instead of the hymns. We seek nothing beyond reality. Within it, everything." Unquote. Mountains and rock face keep appearing in his poems as avatars of this reality. Quote, "It is as if being was to be observed, as if among the possible purposes of what one sees, the purpose that comes first, the surface, is the purpose to be seen. It is to disclose the essential presence, say, of a mountain, expanded and elevated almost into a sense." Unquote. Reality for Stevens is not a collection of solid objects extended in space, but rather the life that is lived in it. One of the very last poems Stevens wrote is a homage to Cézanne and Mont Sainte-Victoire, entitled The Poem that took the place of a mountain. He never called it a homage and so forth, but I do. I will read it and accompany each of its short stanzas with slides of Mont Saint-Victoire in a rough order that I hope traces the paintings taking the place of a mountain. Now I hope this is going to work. Okay. There it was, word for word, the poem that took the place of a mountain. He breathed its oxygen, even when the book lay turned in the dust of his table. It reminded me how he had needed a place to go in his own direction, how he had recomposed the pines, shifted the rocks, and picked his way among clouds for the outlook that would be right, where he would be complete in an unexplained completion. The exact rock where his inexactedness would discover at last the view toward which they edged, where he would lie and, gazing down at the sea, recognize his unique and solitary home. This poem is not about a mountain, nor does it replace a mountain. It is the mountain with its own oxygen. It becomes real because of the speaker's need for it as a place you can go, because mountains that we merely observe are apart from us, rising above the human. In a poem that takes the place of this austerity, the poet can recompose it, pick their way even among the high clouds, discover it as last as a home where you can lie down and rest, do what you could not do on the mountain itself. At the end, the poet is recumbent and alone in a completion, perhaps wrapped in a dream of his own death. It's an expression of a possible vision based on need more than accomplishment, which brings up the question of whether this kind of artistic ambition can only be prospective, only be gradually realized over time and many works, and even then, not complete. Stevens called his long culminating poem on the subject Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, in which he wrote these lines of possibility rather than accomplishment. Quote, "To impose is not to discover winter and to know it well, to find out of nothing to have come on major weather. It is possible, possible, possible. It must be possible." And Cézanne's mountain, we have seen it painted again and again over time, become more and more a part of something, along with the painter. Consider the bare, unpainted patches in the later paintings. Cézanne himself said the canvases were incomplete because of the way light struck his aging eyes. Critics have said they are a new technique of illumination or just unfinished business. In the context of our subject, we might regard the unpainted patches as the projection of future work which can never be completed. At the end of his life, Cézanne wrote to his closest friend, quote, "Nature, I wanted to copy it. I didn't get there." Thank you.